The Duchess's cold, cutting words echoed through the ballroom. "You will never marry my son." But as the aristocracy held their breath, Edward Ashford, Duke of Ravensshade, stunned everyone. In front of his entire family and London's highest society, he dropped to one knee and proposed to the kitchen maid. "Hello, lovely. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face." Chapter 1. The Art of Seeming Present. Lord Edward Ashford had perfected the art of seeming present, while being entirely elsewhere until the moment he saw her. "The roses in your conservatory are remarkable. Your Grace," Lady Caroline Pemberton was saying, her voice pleasant and cultured, exactly as it had been 5 minutes ago when she'd complimented the chandelier, and 10 minutes before that when she'd praised the orchestra. "My mother says the Ashford Gardens rival Kew." "You're very kind," Edward heard himself respond, the words emerging with the practiced ease of a music box mechanism. "I confess that is," his voice trailed away. Across the ballroom, amid the swirling gowns and tailored coats of London's finest, a figure in simple grey moved between the guests with a tray of champagne glasses. She was no one a servant, invisible by design, and yet Edward's attention fixed on her with startling intensity. "Edward has always been a patron of beauty in all forms," his mother said smoothly, her gloved hand tightening almost imperceptibly on his arm. Lady Beatrice Ashford, Duchess of Ravensshade, smiled at Lady Caroline with the satisfaction of a general, watching pieces move across a chessboard. "Perhaps you might walk the gardens together tomorrow, Lady Caroline." "I would be delighted," Lady Caroline replied. Edward nodded automatically, though he couldn't have repeated what he'd just agreed to. The servant girl was steadying a glass that had begun to tilt on her tray, quick reflexes, steady hands, and speaking quietly to a young footman, whose nervousness was evident even from across the room. There was kindness in the gesture, a gentleness that seemed startlingly out of place in the glittering artifice of Ravensshade Manor's grand ballroom. "I have had this same conversation at this same ball for 5 years, Edward thought distantly. "When did I become a clockwork duke?" The ballroom was magnificent tonight, as it was every year for the annual Ashford Ball. Crystal chandeliers caught and scattered light across the polished marble floors. The orchestra played in perfect time from their corner dais. 200 guests from the highest echelons of society moved through the carefully choreographed rituals of aristocratic gathering, the greetings, the gossip, the delicate negotiations of alliance and influence that passed for conversation. And Edward, Duke of Ravensshade at 29, stood at its center, feeling as though he was suffocating in plain air. "You must tell me about your travels to the Lake District," Lady Caroline continued gamely, though Edward noticed, because he was not entirely heartless, the slight dimming of enthusiasm in her eyes. She was trying, and he was failing her with his inattention. Before he could summon a proper response, the servant girl looked up. Their eyes met across the expanse of the ballroom. Amber eyes, he noted with unusual clarity, the color of honey in sunlight. For 3 heartbeats, 1, 2, 3, she held his gaze with a directness that servants were trained never to show. There was no coyness in it, no calculation, just startled recognition, as though she too felt the strange electricity of the moment. Then duty pulled her attention away, and she moved on through the crowd, grey skirts disappearing between clusters of evening dress and military uniform. Edward realized he'd lost the thread of conversation entirely. "Your Grace?" Lady Caroline prompted gently. "Forgive me," Edward said, forcing his attention back to her lovely, patient face. "I find myself somewhat distracted this evening." His mother's fingers pressed warningly against his sleeve, but her smile never wavered. Lady Beatrice had cultivated that smile over 30 years as Duchess of Ravensshade, gracious, controlled, impenetrable. "The evening has been rather overwhelming," she said to Lady Caroline. "So many guests to attend to. You understand, my dear." "Of course," Lady Caroline agreed, because she was well bred enough to accept the excuse even if she didn't quite believe it. Lady Beatrice's other hand went briefly to her wedding ring, turning it once on her finger, a gesture Edward had seen countless times but never truly noticed before. There was something almost melancholy in the movement, there and gone in an instant, before his mother's attention sharpened once more. "I believe the dancing is about to begin," she announced. "Edward, you should claim Lady Caroline's first set." It was not a suggestion. Edward offered his arm with mechanical courtesy. "Would you do me the honor?" Lady Caroline accepted, her smile bright and only slightly strained. She was truly lovely, dark-haired, well-educated, accomplished in all the ways society valued. Her conversation was intelligent, her manners impeccable, her family connections beyond reproach. On paper, she was everything a duchess should be. On paper. Edward led her onto the dance floor as the orchestra struck up a waltz. His hands found their proper positions, one at her waist, one clasping hers, and they began to move through the familiar patterns. Around them, other couples joined the dance, the ballroom transforming into a kaleidoscope of color and movement. "You dance beautifully," Lady Caroline offered. "As do you. The music is lovely. Quite lovely. This is my life," Edward thought as they turned and stepped in perfect synchronization. This endless performance, these hollow exchanges, this suffocation masquerading as civilization. Movement caught his eye. The servant girl was circulating through the edge of the dance floor now, offering refreshments to those watching the dancers. She moved with quiet competence, nearly invisible except Lord Pemberton, Lady Caroline's uncle, and clearly 3 glasses past prudent consumption, stumbled backward directly into her path. The tray tilted dangerously. Crystal glasses slid toward disaster, but the girl's hands moved with remarkable speed, steadying the tray, catching the glasses before they could shatter against the marble floor. Lord Pemberton didn't even notice, didn't apologize, didn't see her at all. He simply continued his loud conversation with his companions, oblivious to the minor catastrophe he'd nearly caused. The girl righted the tray fully, took a steadying breath, and continued on her way as though nothing had happened. Something tightened in Edward's chest. Anger, perhaps, or recognition, or something he couldn't quite name. Lord Pemberton had nearly sent her sprawling, and he hadn't even seen her. How many times had Edward himself failed to see the people who made his comfortable life possible? "Your Grace?" Lady Caroline's voice held a note of concern now. "You seem very distant tonight." "Forgive me," Edward said again, and meant it this time. "Lady Caroline, I find I'm not. That is, I fear I'm poor company this evening. Would you mind terribly if I—" He stopped mid-dance, a social transgression of the first order. Lady Caroline's eyes widened slightly. Around them, Edward could feel attention shifting, could sense the ripple of notice spreading through the ballroom. One did not simply abandon a partner mid-waltz. "I do apologize," Edward said quietly. "Please excuse me." He escorted her to the edge of the dance floor, with what remained of his composure, bowed formally, and walked away before she could respond. He could feel his mother's gaze burning into his back, could imagine the speculation already beginning among the guests, but found he didn't particularly care. Across the room, Lord Vincent Hartley, Edward's closest friend since their days at Cambridge, raised an eyebrow in silent question. Vincent was deep in conversation with a cluster of gentlemen near the refreshment table, but his attention had clearly noted Edward's unprecedented abandonment of the dance floor. Edward ignored him. Near the far wall, Lady Ashworth watched the entire exchange with shrewd, calculating eyes. The elderly dowager had been observing society's dramas for 60 years, and she missed nothing. Edward met her gaze briefly and saw something that might have been understanding or possibly amusement flicker across her lined face. He navigated through the crowd with purpose now, seeking one person in particular. He found Mrs. Thornbury directing a pair of footmen near the ballroom's service entrance. The head housekeeper was a woman of late middle age, with iron-grey hair, and the quiet authority of someone who had managed Ravenshade's staff for 2 decades. "Your Grace," she said, immediately noting his approach, "is something amiss?" "I require refreshments in the library," Edward said, his voice low enough not to carry. "Send," he paused, aware that he was about to do something deliberate, something that might prove significant. "Send Miss Westbrook, if she's available." Mrs. Thornbury's expression remained perfectly neutral, but Edward saw the flicker of calculation in her eyes. She was too experienced, too observant, not to read between the lines of his request. "Miss Westbrook is rather busy, Your Grace," she said carefully. "Perhaps another—" "Nevertheless," Edward interrupted, meeting her eyes with quiet insistence. A moment passed. Mrs. Thornbury studied him with the privilege of long service, seeming to weigh something internal. Finally, she nodded once. "As you wish, Your Grace." Edward inclined his head and retreated from the ballroom before his mother could intercept him. The corridor leading to the library was blessedly quiet, the music and conversation fading to a distant murmur. He let himself into the familiar space floor-to-ceiling shelves, leather furniture, the comfortable smell of old books and wood polish, and moved to the window. Outside, the manor's grounds stretched away into darkness, gardens and parkland disappearing into night. Edward saw his own reflection in the glass, impeccably dressed, perfectly groomed, the very image of aristocratic refinement. Empty. He turned away from the window and waited. In the servants' corridor, Eleanor Westbrook received her instructions from Mrs. Thornbury with growing apprehension. "The Duke has requested refreshments in the library," Mrs. Thornbury said, her voice carrying a warning that Eleanor couldn't quite interpret. "He has specifically requested that you bring them." Eleanor's hands stilled on the tray she'd been organizing. "Me? Why would he?" "I don't know, child, and that concerns me." Mrs. Thornbury's weathered face was uncharacteristically grave. "Mind yourself." "I'm only bringing tea, Mrs. Thornbury." "That's what I'm afraid of." The words hung ominous in the air. Eleanor wanted to ask what Mrs. Thornbury meant, but the head housekeeper had already turned away to direct another servant, and there was nothing to do but prepare the tea service and do as she'd been bid. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she arranged the silver tea service on its tray pot, cups, cream, sugar, the small cakes that were customary for such requests. She was 24 years old, had worked at Ravensshade Manor for a decade, and had served countless members of the aristocracy. This should be routine. It didn't feel routine. She'd noticed him, of course. The Duke was impossible not to notice at his own ball, tall and well-formed, moving through the gathering with practiced grace, drawing attention like gravity drew falling objects. But she'd trained herself not to look, not to notice the people who existed in a different world entirely from her own, until their eyes had met across the ballroom. That moment of connection, electric, startling, impossible, had shaken something loose inside her. For 3 heartbeats, she'd forgotten every rule of service, every carefully learned lesson about remaining invisible. She'd simply looked at him, and he'd looked back, and something had passed between them that Eleanor didn't have words for. Now he'd requested her specifically. Eleanor lifted the tray, her hands steady now through sheer force of will, and made her way through the servants' corridors toward the library. Her grey dress rustled softly in the quiet. Her reflection in the polished wood paneling showed a young woman with brown curls, pinned neatly beneath a white cap, amber eyes uncertain, posture careful and correct. She looked exactly like what she was, a servant, appropriate, invisible, beneath notice. She paused at the library door, gathering courage she hadn't known she'd need for such a simple task. From inside, she heard nothing, no movement, no sound. Eleanor knocked twice. "Enter," came his voice. She opened the door and found the Duke of Ravensshade standing at the window, the ballroom's music a distant echo in the quiet room. He turned, and Eleanor saw in his face not the polished aristocrat from the ballroom, but something raw and searching, something almost vulnerable. "Please," he said quietly, and there was a note in his voice that made her breath catch. "Don't call me Your Grace. Not here. Not tonight." Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, the tea tray suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in her hands, and understood with perfect clarity that Mrs. Thornbury had been right to worry. This was not routine at all. This was the beginning of something dangerous. Chapter 2. Borrowed Books and Hidden Hours. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, the tea tray trembling slightly in her hands. The Duke Edward, he'd asked her to call him, remained by the window, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Your Grace, I've brought the tea you requested." "Edward," he corrected gently. "And thank you, but I didn't truly want tea. I wanted to speak with you." Every instinct screamed at Eleanor to set down the tray and flee. Nothing good could come from a duke requesting private conversation with a kitchen maid. Yet something in his face, that rawness, that searching quality, kept her rooted in place. "I should return to my duties," she managed. "Please, just for a moment." He gestured toward the settee. "Sit, talk with me." "Your Grace, that wouldn't be appropriate." A wry smile touched his lips. "No, I suppose it wouldn't be, but I find I'm rather tired of appropriate this evening." Eleanor set down the tray with careful formality, buying time to gather her scattered thoughts. The library was warm, book-lined, utterly inappropriate for this encounter. Through the walls came the distant strains of the orchestra, the murmur of 200 guests who existed in an entirely different world. "What do you think of when you look at all these books?" Edward asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. "Your Grace?" "Edward. And I'm genuinely asking, When you come in here to tend the fire, to dust the shelves, what do you think? Eleanor hesitated. Truth or propriety? She chose truth. I think how fortunate you are, to have all this knowledge at your fingertips, to be able to read whatever you choose, whenever you choose. Have you read many of them? She shouldn't answer, shouldn't admit to the secret arrangement she had with Mrs. Thornbury, who'd been letting her borrow books for 2 years now. But Edward's interest seemed genuine, and Eleanor found herself wanting to be honest with him. Some, she admitted quietly. Mrs. Thornbury allows me to borrow them, provided I'm careful. I return them exactly as I found them. Edward's face lit with something that might have been delight. What are you reading now? Jane Eyre. And what do you make of Mr. Rochester? Eleanor considered carefully. This was dangerous ground, expressing opinions to a duke, engaging in literary discussion as though they were equals. But he'd asked, and something in her refused to pretend ignorance. I think he believes loving someone gives him the right to deceive them. I think Jane is wiser than he is. Edward leaned forward, genuinely engaged now. Most readers I know find Jane too harsh in leaving him. Then they've never had their choices taken from them by someone who claimed to love them. The words emerged with more bitterness than Eleanor had intended. A beat of silence fell between them. She could see Edward processing her statement, seeing her differently, not as a servant, but as a person with experiences and opinions and depths. No, he said quietly. I suppose they haven't. They talked for 20 minutes more about books, about stories, about the ideas that animated both their minds. When Eleanor finally excused herself, citing duties that couldn't be neglected, her heart was racing in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. This was dangerous. This was impossible. This was the most alive she'd felt in years. Week 1. The second meeting happened by apparent accident. Eleanor entered the library late the following evening to tend the fire, and found Edward already there, reading by lamplight. Forgive me, Your Grace. I didn't realize. Stay, he said. Please. We were just getting to the interesting part of our discussion about Jane. She should have declined. Instead, she stayed for 20 minutes, debating whether Jane's decision to leave Thornfield was strength or stubbornness. Edward argued one side, Eleanor the other, and neither seemed to care particularly about winning, only about the conversation itself. When Eleanor left, her hands were steady, but her mind was not. The third meeting was deliberate. Edward discovered that Eleanor liked to watch the sunrise through the conservatory glass, arriving at 5:30 in the morning before her kitchen duties began. He found her there on a Wednesday, sitting on a stone bench among the palms and orange trees, morning light gilding everything gold. May I join you? He asked. Eleanor should have said no. Instead, she nodded. They sat in silence at first, watching light creep across the grounds. Then, gradually, conversation began. They spoke of growing things, of what made something beautiful, of the natural world that existed outside the rigid constraints of society. Everything here has its place, Eleanor observed, gesturing to the carefully cultivated plants. Nothing grows wild. Even beauty is controlled. Is that wrong? Edward asked. Not wrong, just limited. Some things are more beautiful for being untamed. Edward looked at her when she said it, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd been speaking of plants, hadn't she? By the second week, Eleanor had stopped pretending these meetings were accidental. Edward sought her out now in the old chapel while she cleaned, in the kitchen garden where she cut herbs for cook. The pretense of chance had given way to deliberate choice. In the chapel, he brought her a book. Wuthering Heights, he said, offering it to her. I thought you might enjoy it. Your Grace, I cannot accept. Edward, and yes, you can. Consider it a loan from the library. Eleanor studied him, this duke who kept seeking her out, who brought her books and asked her opinions as though they mattered. Why are you doing this? He met her eyes with perfect honesty. Because talking to you is the first time in years I've felt like myself. The answer undid her. She took the book with trembling hands. In the kitchen garden 2 days later, Edward attempted to help her harvest herbs and proved spectacularly incompetent at the task. He held the basket wrong, cut the stems in the wrong place, managed to drop half of what she'd carefully gathered. Eleanor laughed, couldn't help it, and Edward's face transformed with the sound. I'm hopeless at this, he admitted. Utterly hopeless, she agreed, still laughing. Have you never done any practical work? I've been trained to manage estates, not actually work them. There's a difference, apparently. A significant one. Eleanor took the shears from him before he could damage anything else. "Here, watch." She demonstrated the proper technique, aware of him standing close, paying attention not to the herbs but to her. When she glanced up, the look in his eyes made her breath catch. He was falling in love with her. The realization hit like a physical force. This wasn't idle curiosity or aristocratic condescension. Edward was falling in love with her, and Eleanor, God help her, was falling too. The fifth meeting was the longest. Evening had fallen when Eleanor slipped into the library to find Edward already there. 2 glasses of wine poured, the settee arranged with cushions. Not seduction, she knew what seduction looked like, and this wasn't it. Just intimacy. The quiet intimacy of 2 people who'd come to crave each other's company. Eleanor sat on the settee. Edward took the chair beside her, closer than propriety allowed, but not quite touching. "What do you want, Edward?" she asked suddenly. "Not what's expected, what do you want?" He was quiet for a long moment. Through the window, stars were emerging in a darkening sky. "I want to stop pretending," he said finally. "I want to live a life that's real." "And you think speaking with a kitchen maid is real?" "I think you are the first real thing I've encountered in this house full of performances." Eleanor's breath caught. She should deflect this, should retreat to safety. Instead, she asked, "What was your mother like, before she was the Duchess?" "I don't know," Edward admitted. "I've only ever known her as the Duchess, duty personified. I sometimes wonder if there was ever anything else. Everyone was something else once." "Were you?" Eleanor considered the question. "I was a child who believed the world was kind. Then my mother died, and I learned otherwise. 2 years in a workhouse teaches you what the world truly thinks of people like me." "How did you end up here?" "Mrs. Thornbury." Eleanor smiled slightly. "She was visiting her sister in London, saw me at the workhouse, and for some reason decided I deserved better. She brought me here, gave me work, gave me a chance. I owe her everything." "You owe her opportunity," Edward corrected. "What you've made of it, the intelligence, the character that's yours alone." The words warmed something deep inside Eleanor's chest. She found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by a force she couldn't name. Edward reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. His fingers closed around hers, warm, gentle, impossibly dangerous. They sat like that for a moment that stretched into eternity, hands joined, the space between them charged with possibility. Edward leaned closer. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. His face was inches from hers now, close enough that she could see the exact shade of his eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath. A sound in the corridor, footsteps, a servant passing. Eleanor jerked back, reality crashing down around them. "I should go," she whispered, pulling her hand free. "Eleanor, this is madness. You know it's madness." "Tomorrow?" he asked quietly. "Will you meet me tomorrow?" She should say no, should end this before it spiraled beyond control. But Eleanor had spent 12 years being sensible, being careful, knowing her place. And Edward made her want to forget all of it. "Tomorrow," she breathed. While Eleanor and Edward's connection deepened, the household took notice. Mrs. Thornbury observed Eleanor's absences with growing concern. She'd seen this story before, had lived a version of it herself, 30 years ago, when she'd loved a groomsman named William. The family had sent him away, and Mrs. Thornbury had learned to live with the ache of what might have been. She didn't want that fate for Eleanor. "You're playing with fire, child," she warned one evening, finding Eleanor in the still room, touching the spine of Wuthering Heights with reverent fingers. "I know," Eleanor admitted. "Then stop." "I can't." Mrs. Thornbury sighed, recognizing in Eleanor's face the same helpless longing she'd once felt herself. "Then be careful. Men like that don't marry women like us, even when they want to." Elsewhere in the manor, Lord Vincent Hartley paid a visit and immediately noticed something different about his friend. Edward was distracted, yes, but also lighter, less weighted by the expectations that had always pressed on him. "You've been odd since the ball," Vincent observed, sprawled in a chair in Edward's study. "What's got into you?" "Perhaps I'm tired of being decorative." "Good Lord, don't tell me you're going philosophic. Next you'll be writing poetry." Edward smiled slightly. "Would that be so terrible?" Vincent's expression sobered. "Edward, whatever you're thinking, be careful. Your mother has plans." "My mother always has plans. And she expects you to follow them. You know that." Edward said nothing, which was answer enough. In her private sitting room, Lady Beatrice Ashford sat alone with an old music box. She'd had it for decades, a gift from someone she rarely let herself remember. Her fingers traced the delicate inlay, and for a moment her face showed something other than aristocratic composure. Grief, perhaps, or regret. Then she firmly closed the box, straightened her shoulders, and returned to planning the dinner party that would, she believed, secure Edward's engagement to Lady Caroline. Among the servants, speculation ran wild. "He's been asking about Eleanor," Thomas the footman warned one evening, cornering Eleanor in the servants' hall. "Mind yourself, Ellie. Men like that don't mean well by women like us." "He's been nothing but respectful," Eleanor defended. "That's how it starts." Annie, the young maid who'd become something of a friend to Eleanor, teased her about seeming dreamy. Eleanor deflected, but Annie's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled. The danger building beneath the surface was palpable now. Everyone could feel it. The servants, the household, the very walls of Ravenshade Manor seemed charged with anticipation. Something was going to break. The break came on a Tuesday morning. Eleanor was supposed to meet Edward in the conservatory at dawn. Instead, Lady Beatrice summoned her unexpectedly to discuss household matters, a long, detailed conversation about linens and supplies that kept Eleanor trapped for over an hour. When she finally escaped and ran to the conservatory, Edward was still there, waiting. "I was worried something had happened to you," he said, and the concern in his voice, the genuine fear, revealed more than any declaration could have. "Your Grace, Edward, this cannot continue." "Why not?" "Because I am beginning to depend on it, and that is dangerous for me." Edward closed the distance between them, his eyes searching hers. "Then let it be dangerous for both of us." He kissed her. The kiss was inevitable, impossible, and changed everything. His lips were soft against hers, gentle but certain, and Eleanor felt the last of her resistance crumble. She kissed him back, her hands finding his shoulders, her world narrowing to this moment. This man, this impossible choice. When they pulled apart, Eleanor's hand went to her lips, her eyes wide with fear and wonder. "We cannot," she breathed. "We will," Edward replied, and she knew then that neither of them was strong enough to stop what they'd begun. Chapter 3. The Duchess's Watchful Eyes. 1 month after the ball, Lady Beatrice Ashford summoned her son to her private drawing room with a message delivered through her lady's maid. "A matter of importance requires discussion." Edward arrived at precisely 10 o'clock, finding his mother seated by the window with her morning correspondence arranged on a small table beside her. Sunlight caught the silver in her dark hair, illuminating the fine lines around her eyes, evidence of 3 decades managing Ravenshade and its place in society. She did not smile when he entered. "Sit, Edward. We must speak plainly." Edward remained standing, already guarded. His mother's tone promised unpleasantness. "About?" "About Miss Westbrook." Edward's stillness was answer enough. He felt his expression carefully blank itself, felt his shoulders tighten almost imperceptibly. Lady Beatrice noticed, of course, she noticed. She noticed everything. "You think I don't see what happens in my own household?" she continued, her voice level but sharp beneath. "That I'm blind to the patterns, the absences, the way you've declined every invitation that would take you from Ravenshade these past weeks. I've managed this estate for 30 years, Edward. I notice everything." "Eleanor and I have spoken," Edward said carefully. "That is all." "Eleanor, is it?" Lady Beatrice's eyebrows rose. "First names already. Do you hear yourself? You're addressing a kitchen maid with the familiarity you'd show an equal. She is an intelligent, thoughtful person. Am I not permitted to have a conversation in my own home? With a servant?" Lady Beatrice stood now, her composure cracking slightly. "In secret? At dawn in the conservatory? In the library at night? No, Edward, you are not." So she knew the specifics. Edward felt something cold settle in his chest. "Who told you? Does it matter? Servants talk, even loyal ones, and you've been remarkably indiscreet." She moved closer, studying his face with the intensity of someone reading a ledger. "What I need to know is how far this friendship has progressed. That's none of your concern. Everything regarding the Duke of Ravenshade is my concern." Lady Beatrice's voice hardened. "Answer me, Edward. How far has this gone?" "We've talked, nothing more." It was mostly true. The kiss in the conservatory 2 days ago existed in a space Edward wasn't prepared to discuss, not with his mother, not with anyone. It belonged to him and Eleanor alone. Lady Beatrice studied him for a long moment, then seemed to accept the answer. Then, There's still time to end this before it becomes something that cannot be undone. I have no intention of ending it. Then you force my hand. Lady Beatrice moved to the window, her back to him now. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of old pain. Do you remember your Uncle Robert? Vaguely. He died before I was 10. He was your father's younger brother. Charming, idealistic, convinced that love could conquer all. Lady Beatrice's fingers traced the window frame. He fell in love with an actress, a beautiful woman by all accounts, but entirely unsuitable. The family forbade the match. He defied us and married her anyway. Edward said nothing, sensing his mother needed to tell this story. Society closed every door, Lady Beatrice continued. His political career ended before it truly began. Business associates withdrew their partnerships. The invitations stopped coming. Within a year, they were living on the edges of respectability. Within 2, they were poor. She turned back to face him, and Edward saw genuine anguish in her expression. She left him within 3 years for a man who could provide for her. Robert started drinking. He was dead of liver failure by 40, alone and broken. Lady Beatrice's voice caught slightly. I watched my sister, your Aunt Margaret, suffer through that scandal. The whispers, the shame, the slow dissolution of everything our family had built. I will not watch you suffer the same fate. That was a different situation. It is exactly the same. Lady Beatrice's composure finally shattered. You are infatuated with someone beneath your station. You believe love is enough. It isn't. It never is. This will end in ruin, Edward, yours and hers. Edward chose his words carefully. You speak of stations as though they're immutable laws of nature. They're not. They're conventions, arbitrary ones. They are the foundations of civilization itself. Perhaps civilization's foundations need examining. Lady Beatrice stared at him as though he'd become a stranger. When did you become so naive? This isn't a philosophical debate, Edward. This is your life, your duty, your name. And what of my happiness? The question hung between them. Lady Beatrice's face twisted with something that might have been grief. Happiness is a luxury of the lower classes. We have responsibilities. In that moment, Edward saw something in his mother's face, a flash of old grief, old loss, and understood with sudden clarity that she was speaking from experience. Lady Beatrice had sacrificed something once, had chosen duty over desire, and the wound had never quite healed. Mother, he said more gently, what did you give up? She turned away sharply. That's not relevant to this discussion. I think it is. What's relevant, Lady Beatrice said, her voice regaining its steel, is that I am asking you, as your mother, to end this, whatever this is, immediately. And if I refuse? Lady Beatrice met his eyes with absolute certainty. Then I will have no choice but to dismiss Miss Westbrook from service. Edward felt fury rise, cold and clear. You would do that? Destroy her livelihood to control me? I would do anything to protect you from yourself. That's not protection. That's tyranny. Call it what you will. Lady Beatrice moved to her desk, shuffling papers with deliberate calm. You have until the end of the week. End this friendship, or I will end her employment. She would have no references, Edward said slowly, understanding the full weight of the threat. Without references, she cannot find another respectable position. Then perhaps she should have considered that before encouraging the attention of a duke. She encouraged nothing. If anyone is at fault, it's me. Then prove it, Lady Beatrice said coldly. End this before she pays the price for your indiscretion. Edward stared at his mother, this woman who had raised him, who claimed to love him, who was now threatening to destroy an innocent woman to bend him to her will. I never knew you could be cruel. Something flickered across Lady Beatrice's face. Pain, perhaps, but her voice remained steady. I'm being practical. Someone must be. Edward turned and left without another word. In the stillroom, Eleanor's hands stilled over the herbs she'd been preparing. Mrs. Thornbury had entered, with an expression Eleanor had learned to read over 10 years, concern mixed with resignation. Her Grace was asking about you this morning, Mrs. Thornbury said without preamble. Eleanor's breath caught. What did she ask? How long you've been here? What your duties are? Whether you've been satisfactory. And what did you say? The truth, that you're the finest worker I've had in 20 years. Mrs. Thornbury moved closer, lowering her voice though they were alone. But Eleanor, she knows. Knows what? Don't play innocent with me, child. I've seen the way you both move through this house like planets in orbit, drawn to each other despite all sense. She knows, and she won't allow it. Eleanor's fingers tightened on the herbs. There's nothing to allow. We're friends, that's all. Is it? Mrs. Thornbury's voice was gentle but firm. Eleanor couldn't answer, couldn't voice the truth that had become impossible to ignore, that she'd fallen in love with Edward Ashford despite every attempt to guard her heart, despite knowing it was hopeless, despite understanding exactly how this story would end. Mrs. Thornbury sighed, sitting heavily on the still room's single stool. I told you once about my William. Worked in the stables here, 30 years ago. I was lady's maid to the mistress then. Her weathered face softened with memory. We loved each other, true. Talked about running away together, starting fresh somewhere no one knew us. What happened? Her ladyship found out. William was sent away that same day, no references, no warning. I never saw him again. Mrs. Thornbury met Eleanor's eyes. I heard years later he'd married a farmer's daughter in Yorkshire, had 5 children, died happy, I hope. Why are you telling me this? Because you need to decide. Can you walk away from his grace before it's too late, or are you already too far gone? Eleanor closed her eyes. The answer was written in the way her heart leaped whenever Edward entered a room, in the way his voice in the darkness of the library felt like coming home, in the memory of his kiss, desperate and gentle and full of impossible promises. I'm already too far gone, she whispered. Mrs. Thornbury touched her shoulder briefly. Then God help you both. 2 days later, Eleanor waited in the kitchen garden at dawn, uncertain if Edward would come. Lady Beatrice's deadline loomed, 3 days remaining. Eleanor had spent the intervening time in an agony of indecision, knowing what she should do, unable to force herself to do it. Edward appeared through the morning mist, looking strained. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his cravat was askew, small imperfections that would have been unthinkable a month ago. She knows, Eleanor said without preamble. Yes, she's threatened to dismiss me. Edward gave a bitter laugh. Of course you've worked that out. You're always 3 steps ahead. Then we must stop seeing each other. It's the only sensible. Is that what you want? Edward moved closer, his eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. What I want is irrelevant. I need to keep my position. I have nowhere else to go. Come away with me. Eleanor stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What? Leave Ravenshade. We could go to London, to the continent. I have money of my own investments, properties not tied to the estate. We could. Edward, stop! Eleanor gripped his arms, trying to anchor him to reality. You're not thinking clearly. I've never thought more clearly in my life. You would give up everything? Your home, your title, your family? For what? For me? A woman you've known for a month? Yes. The simplicity of it, the absolute certainty in his voice, undid her. Eleanor felt tears spill over. I cannot let you do that. It's not your choice to make. Then I'm making a different choice. She stepped back, putting distance between them before she lost her resolve entirely. I'm leaving. I'll request a transfer to your aunt's estate in Scotland. Mrs. Thornbury can arrange it. No, this is the only way. If I stay, you'll defy your mother. You'll destroy your life for someone who isn't worth it. Edward gripped her shoulders, his face fierce. Don't you dare say that. Don't you dare diminish yourself. I'm being realistic. I'm a servant, Edward. That's the truth. And you're a duke. And no amount of feeling changes that fundamental fact. Then I will change it. His voice was low, dangerous, with determination. The whole damn system, if I must. But I will not let you leave. You can't stop me. Watch me. He kissed her then, fiercely, desperately, pouring into the kiss all the fear and longing and impossible hope that had been building between them. Eleanor kissed him back with equal desperation, her hands fisting in his coat, her tears mixing with the kiss. When they parted, both breathing hard, Edward framed her face with his hands. I will find a way. I swear to you, Eleanor, I will find a way. Eleanor wanted to believe him, wanted it with a fierceness that terrified her. But as she watched him walk back toward the manor, his shoulders set with determination, Eleanor knew that love alone could not bridge the chasm between their worlds, and that trying might destroy them both. Chapter 4. The Investigation and the Plan. 3 days after his confrontation with his mother, Edward sat surrounded by law books in his study. Volumes on marriage law, estate settlements, and legal precedents covered every available surface. His normally immaculate desk had disappeared beneath papers, covered in his cramped handwriting notes, calculations, arguments constructed and dismantled. The research had consumed him for 72 hours. What he'd discovered was both encouraging and damning. There was no legal barrier to his marrying Eleanor. His title was hereditary, granted by royal patent 2 centuries ago. It could not be stripped, could not be revoked, regardless of whom he chose as his Duchess. The estate was entailed to him and his heirs. His mother's threats, however forcefully delivered, were ultimately empty from a legal standpoint. But law and society were different beasts entirely. Edward leaned back in his chair, pressing his palms against tired eyes. The social consequences would be severe, he harbored no illusions about that. Ostracism, certainly. Political opportunities vanishing. Business partnerships dissolved. The careful web of aristocratic connection that sustained families like his would fray and break. Yet as he contemplated this future, isolated but honest, scandalous but real, Edward found he didn't care as much as he should have. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, Lord Vincent Hartley entered without ceremony. "Your butler says you're not receiving," Vincent announced, raising an eyebrow. "Since when?" "Since I have more important things to do than make small talk." Vincent's gaze swept the study, taking in the scattered books, the disordered papers, Edward's disheveled appearance. His eyes lingered on the open volume of marriage law on the desk. Marriage law? Estate settlements? "Edward, what are you planning?" Edward made a decision in that moment to trust completely or not at all. Vincent had been his closest friend since Cambridge. If anyone deserved the truth, it was him. "I'm going to marry Eleanor Westbrook." Vincent sat heavily in the chair opposite, his usual easy manner evaporating. "The kitchen maid." "Yes." "Your mother will have apoplexy." "My mother doesn't govern my life." Vincent was silent for a long moment, studying Edward with unusual intensity. "No, but society does. Edward, I'm your friend, so I'll speak plainly. This isn't just about your mother. You'll be ostracized, cut from every list, your political prospects done. The clubs will blackball you. Investment opportunities will dry up. They'll make your life unbearable. I don't care. You say that now. I say it with full knowledge of the consequences." Edward leaned forward, his voice steady with conviction. "Vincent, I've been performing my entire life, playing the role of perfect aristocrat, perfect son, perfect duke, speaking words I don't believe to people I don't respect about matters I don't care about. I'm done." Vincent studied him for a long, measuring moment. "You're serious?" "Completely." Another pause, then Vincent's face broke into an unexpected smile. "Then I'm with you." Edward blinked, certain he'd misheard. "What?" "Someone needs to stand by you when you do this mad thing. Might as well be me." Vincent stood, extending his hand. "Though for the record, I think you're completely insane." Edward gripped his hand, feeling a knot in his chest loosen slightly. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You'll be dragging me down with you, you realize. Anyone who supports you will face consequences too." "I know, and I wouldn't ask." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Vincent settled back into his chair. "Now then, tell me your plan." While Edward plotted his future, Lady Beatrice worked to prevent it. In her private sitting room, she composed careful letters to contacts in London. Her handwriting remained steady, each word precisely chosen. She was arranging for Eleanor's placement elsewhere, a respectable position in a household far from Ravensshade, complete with excellent references. "The girl is competent and deserves a good situation," she wrote to Lady Pemberton. "I'm prepared to provide the highest references if you can place her immediately. The matter is urgent and concerns my son's welfare. I trust your discretion in this delicate situation." Lady Beatrice set down her pen, reviewing the letter with satisfaction. This was mercy, she told herself. Protection, a clean separation that would spare both Edward and the girl the pain of a prolonged attachment. In a year, perhaps 2, Edward would thank her for this intervention. She couldn't comprehend that his feelings might be serious, that a month of conversations could forge something deeper than infatuation. A knock interrupted her work. Her butler announced Lady Ashworth, and before Lady Beatrice could decide whether to receive her, the elderly dowager swept into the room with the privilege of long acquaintance. "I hear there's drama brewing at Ravensshade," Lady Ashworth announced without preamble, settling into a chair uninvited. Lady Beatrice maintained her composure through long practice. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Oh, stop it, Beatrice. I've known you since you were in leading strings. Your son is in love with someone inappropriate. It's a passing fancy." He'll recover. Will he? Lady Ashworth's shrewd eyes missed nothing. You didn't. Lady Beatrice felt her control slip slightly. I don't know what you're referring to. The music teacher, Antonio something or other. Your father sent him away before the season ended. You married Ravenshade 6 months later, looking absolutely miserable at your own wedding. Don't think I've forgotten. That was 30 years ago. Lady Beatrice's voice came out tight, strained. And you're still bitter, still grieving what you gave up. Lady Ashworth leaned forward. So tell me, Beatrice, are you protecting Edward, or are you punishing him for having the courage you didn't? Get out! The words emerged as barely controlled fury. Lady Ashworth rose with dignity, but her voice softened slightly. I'm trying to help, old friend. Don't make your son pay for your regrets. She left, and Lady Beatrice sat alone in the sudden silence, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the music box on her desk, the one Antonio had given her 3 decades ago, the one she'd never quite been able to discard. In the servants' quarters that evening, Eleanor packed her meagre belongings with mechanical precision. 2 dresses, a shawl, the book Edward had given her, her mother's wedding ring on its chain. Everything she owned fit into a single worn bag. Mrs. Thornbury had arranged a position at Lord Pemberton's estate. Eleanor would leave in 2 days. She hadn't told Edward couldn't bear to see his face when she explained that she was choosing safety over love, practicality over hope. Annie, the young maid who'd become something of a confidant, watched from the doorway with obvious distress. You're really leaving? It's for the best. But you'll miss him terrible. Anyone can see you're in love. Eleanor's hands stilled on the dress she was folding. Which is exactly why I must go. Love isn't enough, Annie. It doesn't pay rent or put food on the table. But he's rich, which doesn't matter if society destroys him for choosing me. Eleanor resumed packing, forcing her voice to remain steady. I won't be responsible for that. I won't watch him sacrifice everything, his position, his family, his future, for a woman he's known a month. That's not love. That's madness. Maybe love is supposed to be a bit mad, Annie suggested quietly. Eleanor didn't answer, couldn't answer, because part of her agreed, and that part terrified her most of all. Edward discovered his mother's machinations through an unexpected source. Mr. Simmons, Lady Beatrice's elderly secretary, appeared at Edward's study door late that afternoon with a folded paper and an expression of obvious internal conflict. Your Grace, he said quietly, I believe you should see this. I've served your family for 40 years, and my conscience will not allow. He stopped, seeming unable to continue, and simply handed Edward the paper. It was a draft of his mother's letter. Edward read it twice, feeling cold rage crystallize in his chest. Thank you, Simmons, he managed. The secretary nodded and retreated, leaving Edward alone with the evidence of his mother's interference. She thinks to manage me like a chess piece, Edward thought, his hands clenching on the paper. She thinks Eleanor can be simply relocated like a problem to be solved, that separation and distance will cure what she sees as temporary madness. She has no idea what she's forced me to do. Edward found Eleanor in the old chapel as twilight deepened into night. She was already there, sitting on the stone floor with her back against the altar, and even in the dim light he could see her packed bag tucked in the shadows behind her. You were going to leave without telling me. Eleanor looked up, tears already tracking down her face. I was going to send word. A letter? Edward moved closer, his voice rough with hurt and anger. After everything, a letter? It's easier this way. Easier for whom? For both of us. Eleanor stood, wrapping her arms around herself. Edward, your mother is right. This is impossible. Every day we continue is another day we make it worse. I have to go. No. You can't stop me. You're right. Edward stopped a few feet away, close enough to see every detail of her face in the candlelight. I can't force you to stay, but I can give you a reason to. There is no reason. Edward dropped to his knees before her. Eleanor's breath caught. What are you doing? Marry me. Shock rendered her momentarily speechless. What? I'm asking you to be my wife, not my mistress, not my secret, my wife, my Duchess. Edward, stand up. Her voice broke. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. He stayed on his knees, looking up at her with absolute certainty. I've spent the last 3 days researching every legal precedent. I've consulted with Vincent. I've thought through every consequence, the social isolation, the political ruin, the financial complications, all of it. And my answer is yes, To all of it. If it means having you. They'll destroy you. They'll try. But Eleanor, listen to me. He reached for her hands, and after a moment's hesitation, she let him take them. I've been living a half-life, playing a role, being the Duke everyone expects charming, appropriate, utterly empty. And then I met you, and for the first time in my life I felt awake. I cannot go back to sleep. Your mother will rage, will threaten, and ultimately will have to accept it because I am Duke of Ravenshade, not her. The title is mine, not hers to grant or take away. Society will shun us, then we'll build a new society. Edward's grip on her hands tightened. Vincent's already committed to standing with us. Others will too, Lady Ashworth, I think, and perhaps more than we expect. And those who won't? Their friendship was always conditional anyway. I don't want conditional love, Eleanor. I want you. Eleanor was wavering. He could see it in her face, in the way her tears fell faster, even as her grip on his hands strengthened. I'm so afraid. So am I. But I'm more afraid of losing you, of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been, of becoming like my mother, bitter and hollow because I chose duty over truth. Eleanor's voice emerged as barely a whisper. If I say yes, and I'm not saying I am, but if I did, how would we even do this? Edward rose, still holding her hands, hope kindling in his chest. There's a royal charity gala in 1 week. Every important family in London will be there. I'm expected to attend, to dance with Lady Caroline, to play my part. I don't see how that helps. I want you there, with me, and I want to propose to you in front of all of them. Eleanor's breath caught. That's madness. It's clarity. No room for misunderstanding. No way for my mother to quietly dissolve the engagement behind our backs. A public declaration that cannot be undone. He searched her face desperately. So what do you say, Eleanor Westbrook? Will you take this mad leap with me? The silence stretched. Edward could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Eleanor's pulse racing beneath his fingers where he held her hands. Everything hung in balance, his future, his happiness, his one chance at a life that felt real. Yes, Eleanor whispered. Yes? Edward couldn't quite believe it. You mean, yes, her voice strengthened. Yes, I'll marry you, Edward Ashford, and God help us both. They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of terror and triumph. Eleanor's arms coming around his neck, Edward pulling her close, both of them trembling with the magnitude of what they'd just agreed to. The kiss deepened, desperate and sweet, full of fear and hope in equal measure. Outside the chapel, neither noticed the figure in the shadows. Lady Beatrice's lady's maid had followed Eleanor at her mistress's instruction, and she'd heard everything, the proposal, the acceptance, the plan for the gala. By morning, the Duchess would know everything, and the final battle would begin. Chapter 5. The Duchess's Last Stand. The summons came at dawn, unusual enough to set Edward's nerves on edge before he'd even left his chambers. Lady Beatrice never requested his presence before breakfast unless something was seriously wrong. He found her in her private rooms, still in her dressing gown, pacing like a caged animal. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and her normally immaculate hair hung loose around her shoulders. Edward had never seen his mother so undone. Tell me it isn't true. Edward closed the door carefully behind him. Good morning, Mother. Tell me you did not propose marriage to that girl. He met her eyes steadily, his decision made and unmovable. Her name is Eleanor, and yes, I did. She accepted. Lady Beatrice actually staggered, gripping the back of a chair for support. Have you lost your mind? No, I've found it. This is not a jest, Edward, her voice cracked. This is your life, your future, your family's legacy, all of which belong to me, not to you. Edward remained calm, though his heart hammered. I'm 29 years old, Mother. I've fulfilled every duty you've asked of me. This is the one thing I'm choosing for myself. Lady Beatrice steadied herself, and Edward watched as she visibly gathered her composure, pulling on the armor of aristocratic authority like a familiar cloak. When she spoke again, her voice was controlled, methodical, all the more devastating for its precision. You will be ostracized. Every door will close. Lady Marlborough has already written to say she cannot receive you if this proceeds. Lord Pemberton has sent word that his family will cut all ties. That's just the beginning, Edward. Do you understand? Society will destroy you. I've prepared for the social consequences. I accept them. You don't understand what you're accepting. Lady Beatrice moved closer, her face desperate now. Your seat in Parliament, do you think they'll let you keep it? Your grandfather built that influence over 40 years. You'll destroy it in a day. For what? For a servant girl who— For the woman I love, Edward interrupted, his voice hardening. And if Parliament cannot accept my choice of wife, then it's not an institution I care to be part of. You're being naive, criminally naive. Lady Beatrice began pacing again. Half our business connections are through family alliances. Lord Pemberton will withdraw his partnership. The banking consortium will dissolve. Your father spent his entire life building those relationships. The estate is profitable on its own merits, Edward countered. We don't need Pemberton's partnership. We never did. And if business associates will only work with us if I marry appropriately, they're not business associates worth having. You speak as though principals can pay bills. Lady Beatrice whirled on him. Your father built this estate into what it is. Your grandfather, your great-grandfather, all of them protected the Ashford name. And you'll drag it through the mud for a girl who has nothing to offer. She has no education in managing an estate, no understanding of society, no connections to bring to the family. What does she offer, except— She couldn't finish, couldn't voice the crude implication. She's brilliant, Mother. Edward's voice was quiet but firm, self-educated. She knows more about estate management than half the ladies you've introduced me to. She's worked it from the ground up, understands the practical realities of running a household in ways Lady Caroline never will, and she has something none of them have. What? Lady Beatrice demanded. She sees me, not the title, not the fortune, me. Edward met his mother's eyes. And I see her. That's worth more than all the connections in London. Something in Lady Beatrice's face crumpled. The mask slipped, revealing the woman beneath, frightened, grief-stricken, desperate. I'm trying to protect you, she said, and now there were tears streaming down her face. Why can't you see that? Edward's voice softened. I know you are, but your protection is suffocating me. I cannot bear to watch you destroy yourself. I'm not destroying myself. I'm finally building myself. For the first time in my life, I'm choosing something real. You're throwing away everything for a woman you barely know. The words hung in the air. Edward let the silence stretch for a moment before asking quietly, How long did you know father before you married him? Lady Beatrice stiffened. That was different. How? How was it different? You married for duty, for family. Edward moved closer, his voice gentle but relentless. Did you love him? His mother was silent. Did you love him when you married him? I grew to love him. That's not an answer. Lady Beatrice turned away, her shoulders trembling. No. Were you in love with someone else? The question seemed to break something inside her. Lady Beatrice sank into a chair, suddenly looking much older than her 50 years. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. His name was Antonio Bianchi. He was my music teacher. I was 19. Edward sat across from her, giving her space to tell the story she'd apparently held inside for 3 decades. What happened? We fell in love. Desperately. Completely. A ghost of a smile touched Lady Beatrice's lips. He wanted to marry me. He didn't care about money or title. He just wanted me. For myself. Not for being the Earl of Westfield's daughter. Just for being Beatrice. And my father found out. Sent him away without even letting me say goodbye. I never saw him again. Lady Beatrice's hands twisted in her lap. 3 months later, I was engaged to your father. 6 months after that, married. Did you ever try to find him? What would have been the point? I was married. He'd moved on, I assumed. Some things, once broken, cannot be mended. Edward felt a surge of pity for his mother, for the girl she'd been, forced to surrender her heart for duty. And you've regretted it ever since. Lady Beatrice's tears fell freely now. Every single day. Every time I played piano, he taught me that sonata you love, the one I play when I think no one's listening. Every time I heard Italian spoken, every time I looked at your father and felt nothing. Affection, yes. Partnership, eventually. But not love. Never love. Then why, Edward asked gently, are you trying to force the same fate on me? Because Antonio and I would have been poor. We would have struggled. I thought I convinced myself that I was protecting you from the same hardship. But you weren't poor with father, and you weren't happy either. Lady Beatrice looked up at him, her face ravaged by grief. No, I wasn't. Edward knelt beside his mother's chair, taking her hands. Mother, I'm not you, and Eleanor isn't Antonio. The circumstances are different. My title protects me in ways your gender never protected you. I have financial independence through my inheritance, and I won't make the same choice you did. I won't sacrifice love for comfort and spend the next 30 years regretting it." Lady Beatrice pulled her hands away, standing abruptly and moving to the window. Edward could see her rebuilding her composure, brick by brick. "If you do this, if you truly do this, I cannot support you. I cannot stand beside you at that gala and watch you throw your life away. I'm not asking you to stand beside me. I'm asking you not to stand against me. That's the same thing." "No, Mother," Edward said quietly. "It's not." Lady Beatrice was silent for a long moment, staring out at the grounds. "The gala is in 5 days. If you propose to that girl in public, our relationship will be irreparably damaged." "Then it will be damaged." Edward felt the words like a blade in his chest, but he didn't waver. "But perhaps one day, when you've had time to think, when you remember how it felt to love Antonio, you'll understand." Lady Beatrice turned, her face composed again, but her eyes still wet. "I will be at the gala. I will fulfill my social obligations, but I will not bless this union. I will not pretend to approve. I don't need your blessing, Mother." Edward moved toward the door. "But I would have liked it." In Mrs. Thornbury's private sitting room, Eleanor stood before a mirror, barely recognizing herself. The dress Mrs. Thornbury had commissioned was simple but elegant sage green silk that brought out the amber in her eyes, with clean lines that didn't pretend to compete with aristocratic extravagance. "It's beautiful," Eleanor whispered. "Mrs. Thornbury, you shouldn't have." "Hush, child. I've been saving for 40 years, never had anyone to spend it on. Let me do this." Eleanor turned, tears threatening. "It's not too late to change my mind." "Yes, it is." Mrs. Thornbury smiled sadly. "I've watched you this past day. You've changed your mind 1,000 times since he proposed, haven't you? At least 1,000, but you keep coming back to the same answer." Eleanor nodded. "That I'd rather risk everything with him than have nothing without him." Mrs. Thornbury's weathered face softened with emotion. "Oh, child, you're braver than I ever was. Or more foolish. Perhaps there's no difference." Lord Vincent found Edward in the study that afternoon, staring at nothing. "Your mother's lady's maid says the Duchess wept for an hour this morning," Vincent reported, settling into a chair. "First time the staff has ever seen it." "I know. I caused it." "Regrets?" Edward considered the question honestly. Regrets that it had to come to this, but not regrets about Eleanor. Vincent studied him. "The betting books at White's have you at 50-1 against actually going through with it." Edward managed a slight smile. "Then I hope you placed your money wisely." "I put £500 on you." "Vincent." "Worth it to prove those pompous fools wrong." Vincent leaned forward. "Edward, I want you to know whatever happens, you're not facing it alone." That evening, a letter arrived for Edward. He recognized Lady Caroline's elegant handwriting immediately. "Your Grace, Edward. I release you from any expectation our families may have held. I wish you to know that I bear no ill will. Your honesty, though late, is more respectful than a loveless marriage would have been. If you are determined on this course, pursue it with courage. Society will be harsh, but society is not always right. With sincere wishes for your happiness, Caroline Pemberton." Edward folded the letter carefully, feeling respect and gratitude. Caroline deserved better than to be the forgotten casualty of his revolution. In the servants' hall, gossip ran rampant. "Mark my words, it'll end in tears," Thomas the footman predicted darkly. "She's the best of us," Annie shot back fiercely. "And if His Grace sees that, maybe he's the best of them." Cook wiped her hands on her apron. "Either way, we've got front-row seats to history. Never thought I'd see a kitchen maid marry a duke." Lady Ashworth paid another call on Lady Beatrice that evening. "I heard about your conversation with Edward," she said without preamble. "Your spies work quickly." "I don't need spies. Your face tells the story." Lady Ashworth settled into a chair. "You told him about Antonio. It changed nothing." "Did you expect it to?" Lady Ashworth's voice was surprisingly gentle. "Beatrice, that boy is doing what you should have done 30 years ago. The least you can do is not make it harder. I cannot bless this." "Then don't. But don't curse it either. Stay neutral, if you must, but don't stand in his way. It's too late for neutrality." "It's never too late." Lady Ashworth stood to leave. "The gala is in 5 days. You have time to decide what kind of mother you want to be. 5 days until the Royal Charity Gala. 5 days until Edward would propose to Eleanor in front of London society. 5 days until everything changed forever. In Ravensshade Manor, 3 people prepared for battle. Edward with resolution, Eleanor with terror, and Lady Beatrice with something far more complicated than either the slow, painful recognition that her son was right, and that she had spent 30 years living the wrong life. But recognition was not the same as acceptance, and acceptance was not the same as surrender. Chapter 6. The Days Between. Day 1. Edward's formal notice to the gala organizers was brief and deliberate. The Duke of Ravensshade will attend the Royal Charity Gala. He will be accompanied by a guest. He requests a moment to address the assembly during the evening's proceedings. The organizers received this with confusion but compliance. A duke's request was not to be refused, and they assumed, as did most of London society, once word spread that Edward would be announcing his engagement to Lady Caroline Pemberton. The whispers travelled through drawing rooms and clubs with the speed of wildfire. "Finally doing his duty," Lady Marlborough remarked to her companions over tea. "About time," Lord Pemberton agreed, already calculating the advantages of such an alliance. Only a few Vincent, Lady Ashworth, Mrs. Thornbury knew the truth, and they waited, holding their breath. Day 2. The dressmaker's shop in Ravensshade Village was modest but respectable. Its proprietress, Miss Hartley, known for skilled work and reasonable prices. Eleanor stood before the mirror in the fitting room, barely recognizing the woman reflected back at her. The sage green silk draped elegantly across her frame, simple but undeniably beautiful. The color brought out the amber in her eyes, and the cut, while modest, suggested refinement rather than pretension. "I look ridiculous," Eleanor said quietly. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Thornbury corrected, adjusting the shoulders. "I look like a servant playing dress-up." Miss Hartley, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and work-worn hands, stepped back to assess her handiwork. "You look like a woman in love. That's all anyone will see if they're looking with kind eyes. And if they're not looking with kind eyes, then they'll see what they expect to see anyway. So you might as well be beautiful while they do it." The shop bell rang. Everyone froze as Lady Ashworth entered, her presence utterly incongruous in the modest establishment. The elderly dowager surveyed the scene with sharp eyes, then focused on Eleanor. "So you're the girl causing all the fuss." Eleanor dropped into a curtsy. "My lady, stand up straight, child. If you're to be a duchess, you can't go about bobbing like a hen." Eleanor straightened, meeting Lady Ashworth's gaze with as much courage as she could muster. "I don't expect to be a duchess, my lady. I expect to be scorned and possibly ruined." Lady Ashworth's face broke into an approving smile. "Good, you're practical. That will serve you better than all the etiquette in the world. Tell me, do you love him?" "Yes." "Enough to watch him suffer for it?" Eleanor answered with painful honesty. "No, but he insists, and I'm too selfish to walk away." To everyone's astonishment, Lady Ashworth laughed a genuine sound of delight. "Honesty. Remarkable. Girl, you'll do just fine." She reached up and unclasped the pearl necklace from around her own neck. "Here, wear these at the gala." "I couldn't possibly—" "Of course you can. They were my mother's. She married for love too, the younger son of a baron when she was meant to marry an earl. Caused an enormous scandal. They were perfectly happy for 50 years. Lady Ashworth pressed the pearls into Eleanor's hands. "Consider it a loan from one rebel to another." Before Eleanor could respond, Lady Ashworth swept out of the shop, leaving 3 stunned women in her wake. Day 3. Edward's study looked like a battlefield. Crumpled papers littered the floor and desk, each one a failed attempt at the speech that would change his life. Vincent sat sprawled in a chair, reading over Edward's shoulder as he wrote yet another draft. "Too defensive. You sound like you're apologizing." Edward crumpled the paper with frustrated energy. "I'm explaining." "Don't explain. Assert. You're a duke, for God's sake. Act like one. I'm asking them to accept something unacceptable." "No." Vincent leaned forward. "You're telling them what you've decided. There's a difference." Edward stared at the blank page before him, then began writing with new determination. When he finished, he handed the paper to Vincent. Vincent read aloud, "Lords, ladies, distinguished guests, I stand before you to announce my engagement, not to the woman you expect, but to the woman I choose. Miss Eleanor Westbrook has done me the honor of accepting my proposal." He continued reading silently, then looked up. "This is better, more ducal, less apologetic. Do you think anyone will actually accept this?" Vincent considered the question with his characteristic honesty. 20% will cut you immediately. 50% will wait to see which way the wind blows. 20% will secretly admire you, but be too cowardly to say so publicly. And 10% will genuinely support you. 10%. It's better than 0, and it's enough to build on. Day 4. Eleanor couldn't sleep. The gala loomed tomorrow, one day away, and panic had set in with the force of a physical assault. In the darkness of her small room, she lit a candle and began writing a letter she knew she shouldn't write, couldn't send, but needed to purge from her system. Dearest Edward, I cannot do this. I thought I could, but I cannot. The closer it comes, the more I see how much you'll lose. Your position, your family, your place in the world, all for me. And what do I bring you except scandal and ruin? You say you love me, and I believe you, but love isn't enough when it destroys everything around it. I won't be the reason you're unhappy in 10 years, 20 years, when the novelty has worn off and you realize what you've sacrificed. Please forgive me. Please understand. I'm going away tonight. Don't look for me. Live the life you were meant to live, with someone who can stand beside you without shame. All my love, always Eleanor. She sat with the letter, tears falling onto the paper, blurring the ink. Her bag was packed. She could leave now, disappear into the night, save Edward from himself. The door opened without a knock. Mrs. Thornbury stood in the doorway, fully dressed despite the late hour. I knew you'd be doing this. Doing what? Talking yourself out of happiness. Give me that letter. How did you... I've known you for 12 years, child. I know how your mind works. Now give it here. Eleanor handed over the letter with trembling fingers. Mrs. Thornbury tore it into pieces without reading a single word. Listen to me, the older woman said, her voice fierce with emotion. I let my William go. I let them send him away without fighting. Do you know what I regret? Losing him? No. I regret not fighting. I regret being sensible. I regret protecting myself from risk and ending up with nothing but safety. Safety, Eleanor, is cold comfort when you're old and alone. But I'm being selfish. Good. Be selfish. Take what you want. Fight for it. If it ends badly, at least you'll have tried. But if you walk away now, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering, and I can tell you from experience, wondering is worse than knowing. Eleanor's tears fell harder now. I'm so afraid. Mrs. Thornbury pulled her into a fierce embrace. So be afraid, be terrified, and do it anyway. Day 5. Morning. Edward stood before his mirror in full formal dress, black tailcoat, white waistcoat, perfectly tied cravat. His valet stepped back with satisfaction. You look every inch a duke, Your Grace. Edward studied his reflection and saw a stranger. I don't feel like one. That's how you know it's real, sir. In the servants' quarters, Mrs. Thornbury helped Eleanor into the sage green gown. The fabric whispered as it settled into place. Annie fastened Lady Ashworth's pearls around Eleanor's neck with reverent hands. You're beautiful, Miss Eleanor, the young maid breathed. You show them. Eleanor looked at herself in the small mirror and saw a woman she didn't recognize. Elegant, composed, almost regal. It terrified her. In her own chambers, Lady Beatrice dressed in her most formidable gown, deep blue silk, that made her look like armor disguised as fashion. She looked at her reflection and saw both who she was and who she might have been had she possessed courage 30 years ago. Her hand went to the music box on her dressing table. She opened it, listened to a few notes of the melody Antonio had taught her, then closed it firmly. Her decision was made, though she'd shared it with no one. The journey. Edward's carriage stopped at the servants' entrance. Eleanor's insistence, her last gesture of honoring where she'd come from. When she stepped out in the sage green gown with pearls gleaming at her throat, Edward's breath caught. You're stunning. I'm terrified. So am I. Shall we be terrified together? Eleanor managed a tremulous smile and took his offered hand. Inside the carriage, they sat close, hands clasped so tightly their fingers went white. The city approached through the windows, London's lights glowing like stars brought to earth. We could still turn back, Edward said quietly as the buildings grew taller around them. Run away to Scotland, marry quietly. Is that what you want? No, I want the world to know. I want there to be no doubt, no question. I want to declare my love for you in front of everyone who said it was impossible. Then that's what we'll do. You're sure? Eleanor turned to him, seeing the fear and hope warring in his face. I'm sure I love you. Everything else, We'll figure out as we go." The carriage rolled to a stop in front of the Grand Royal Hotel, where the charity gala was already in full swing. Through the tall windows, they could see hundreds of guests in their finest London's entire aristocracy gathered under one roof. Light and music spilled out into the street. Edward helped Eleanor down from the carriage, feeling her hand tremble in his. "Once we walk through those doors," he said quietly, "there's no going back." Eleanor looked up at the glowing windows, at the world of wealth and privilege that had never been meant for her. Then she looked at Edward, at the man who was willing to risk all of it for her, at the future they would build or break together. "Then let's not go back," she said, her voice steady now. "Let's only go forward." Together, they climbed the steps toward the future they would create, toward the scandal they would cause, toward the love they would defend. The doorman opened the doors with a bow, and London society held its breath. Chapter 7. The Point of No Return. The Grand Royal Hotel's ballroom was a cathedral of wealth and privilege, crystal chandeliers casting diamonds of light across marble floors, an orchestra playing softly from their corner dais, and everywhere the cream of London society in their finest evening dress. 200 of England's most powerful families gathered in careful clusters, their conversations a symphony of influence and alliance. Into this glittering world walked Edward Ashford, Duke of Ravenshade, with Eleanor Westbrook on his arm. The moment they crossed the threshold, Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in the room. Edward was impeccable in black evening dress, his bearing every inch the aristocrat. She wore her simple sage green gown and Lady Ashworth's pearls, which caught the candlelight and seemed to burn at her throat. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The orchestra continued. Conversations flowed. Then, like a stone dropped into still water, awareness rippled outward. Lady Marlborough's fan snapped shut with an audible crack. Lord Pemberton's champagne glass froze halfway to his lips. Young debutantes began whispering furiously behind their gloved hands. Older matrons exchanged looks weighted with meaning, shock, disapproval, fascination, calculation. The whispers began in earnest, a susurrus of scandal spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. "Is that? Surely not. A servant? At the royal gala? The Duke has lost his mind." Lord Vincent Hartley appeared at Edward's side with the loyalty of true friendship. "Well," he said with studied casualness, "you've certainly made an entrance. Vincent, may I present Miss Eleanor Westbrook?" Edward's voice was steady, deliberate. "Eleanor, Lord Vincent Hartley." Eleanor dropped into a curtsy, grateful for the excuse to look away from the staring crowd. "My lord," Vincent bowed with perfect formality. "Miss Westbrook, I'm to stand with you both through whatever comes next. Fair warning, I think you're both mad, but admirably so." Despite her terror, Eleanor felt a flicker of warmth toward this man, who would risk his own standing for friendship's sake. They had barely moved 3 steps into the ballroom when Lord Pemberton descended upon them, his face florid with rage. "Ashford, what is the meaning of this?" Edward's response was maddeningly calm. "Good evening, Pemberton. Lovely gala. The decorations are particularly fine this year. Don't play games with me." Pemberton's voice rose. "You bring a servant to the royal gala? Have you no shame?" Something sparked in Eleanor, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps courage, perhaps simply the refusal to be invisible any longer. "I'm standing right here, my lord. You may address me directly if you wish." Pemberton's eyes widened. Servants didn't speak like this, didn't meet aristocratic eyes, didn't dare suggest equal footing in conversation. Edward's hand tightened slightly on Eleanor's arm, support, not restraint. "Miss Westbrook is my guest, and shortly she will be my fiancée. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly. This is an outrage. I will not." "Father, enough." Lady Caroline Pemberton appeared beside her father, her hand gentle but firm on his arm. She turned to Edward and Eleanor braced for cruelty. Instead, she found unexpected grace. "Miss Westbrook," Lady Caroline's voice was sincere, "I wish you joy, truly." Eleanor felt tears threaten. "Thank you, my lady. That is more than kind." Lady Caroline met Edward's eyes. "You deserve someone who chooses you for yourself. I hope she realizes she's lucky." She turned and walked away with quiet dignity, leaving her father sputtering behind her. Eleanor watched her go, feeling both gratitude and guilt for this woman who'd been cast aside for her. The ballroom had divided itself into visible factions. Lord Marlborough turned his back with deliberate ostentation. Lady Ashcroft remarked loudly to her companion, "Standards have fallen indeed." Several groups made pointed exits when Edward and Eleanor approached, as though scandal were contagious. But not everyone fled. Lady Thornhill nodded from across the room, not approaching, but not fleeing either. Younger aristocrats whispered, but stayed, curiosity apparently stronger than propriety. Lord Blackwood watched from a distance with thoughtful eyes, and Lady Ashworth swept forward to position herself deliberately beside Eleanor, her ancient authority making the gesture unmistakable support. An elderly Earl Eleanor didn't recognize approached with slow, measured steps. Lord Whitmore had the weathered face of someone who'd lived fully and stopped caring what others thought decades ago. "Ashford," he said, extending his hand. "I married a vicar's daughter 40 years ago. Society said I was mad. Best decision I ever made." Edward gripped his hand gratefully. "Thank you, sir. That means a great deal." Lord Whitmore turned to Eleanor, his eyes kind. "You'll need fortitude, young lady. They'll try to break you. Don't let them." "I'll try, my lord." Then the ballroom doors opened again, and the entire room fell silent. Lady Beatrice Ashford entered like a queen processing to coronation. Her deep blue gown made her look like armor disguised as fashion. Her face was composed, unreadable, formidable. Every eye tracked her progress across the marble floor toward Edward and Eleanor. Would she denounce them? Cause a scene? Leave in protest? Lady Beatrice's footsteps seemed impossibly loud in the hushed ballroom. She stopped directly in front of them, her gaze moving from Edward to Eleanor and back again. "Mother," Edward said quietly. A pause stretched thin enough to break. "Edward." Lady Beatrice turned to Eleanor. "Miss Westbrook." Eleanor curtsied deeply, her heart hammering. "Your Grace." "You are wearing Lady Ashworth's pearls." "She lent them to me, Your Grace. They suit you." The words were neutral, but they weren't condemnation. Eleanor felt dizzy with confused relief. Lady Beatrice looked at Edward. "I do not approve of this. I want that understood." "I know." Another pause. The entire ballroom held its breath. "However," Lady Beatrice's voice carried to every corner of the silent room, "you are my son, and I will not abandon you to face society's judgment alone." She took a position beside them, not touching Eleanor, not smiling, not blessing anything, but present, publicly, visibly present. The shock rippled through the assembly like an earthquake. If the Duchess didn't openly oppose, if Lady Beatrice Ashford, that pillar of propriety, stood beside them, perhaps it wasn't quite as scandalous as they'd thought. The social calculation began in 100 minds at once. The Master of Ceremonies, sensing his moment, called for attention. "My lords, ladies, and distinguished guests, His Grace the Duke of Ravenshade has requested a moment to address the assembly." Edward offered Eleanor his arm. Together they walked to the small raised platform at the ballroom's end. Eleanor's legs felt unsteady, but Edward's presence anchored her. Vincent took position at the platform's base, visible support. Lady Beatrice remained where she was, expressionless. Lady Ashworth watched with open interest. Edward faced the assembled aristocracy of London and spoke clearly. "Lords, ladies, distinguished guests, I stand before you tonight to announce my engagement, not to the woman many expected, but to the woman I have chosen. Miss Eleanor Westbrook has done me the honor of accepting my proposal." Immediate chaos, murmurs, gasps, shocked exclamations. Edward raised his voice slightly. "I know this is unconventional. I know it challenges our traditions, but I ask you to consider, what are traditions worth if they demand we sacrifice our humanity, our happiness, our truth?" Some faces showed hostility, some thoughtfulness, some careful neutrality. Edward pressed forward. "Miss Westbrook is not noble by birth. She was orphaned at 12. She has worked honorably for her living. She is self-educated, well-read, and possesses more genuine intelligence and character than many born to privilege." Eleanor's hand tightened on his arm. He was defending her in front of everyone, claiming her worth publicly, explicitly. "I do not ask your permission. My choice is made. But I hope for your understanding, and perhaps, in time, your respect." He turned to Eleanor, and she saw something unexpected in his face invitation. "Miss Westbrook, the floor is yours if you wish to speak." This wasn't planned. He was giving her agency, her own voice in this moment. Eleanor's mind went blank with terror, then cleared with sudden purpose. She stepped forward slightly, her voice trembling but audible. "I did not expect to speak tonight." Nervous laughter from some quarters. Eleanor took strength from it, at least they were listening. "I'm not going to pretend I belong in this room. I don't. I've spent my adult life serving in houses like this, invisible to most of you. I know how society works. I know what I'm asking His Grace to risk." The room had gone quiet now, actually listening. "But I love him, not his title, not his fortune. Him, the man who sees people as people, not as ranks. The man who judges worth by character, not birth. And yes, I'm afraid. I'm terrified. But I would rather face the world beside him than hide from it without him." The simplicity of it seemed to strike something. Eleanor saw faces soften slightly, saw calculation give way to something almost like respect. "I don't expect your approval, but I hope you'll judge me by my actions in the years to come, not by my origins. Thank you." Edward took both her hands, his eyes bright with pride and love. Then, to gasps throughout the ballroom, he knelt before her. "Eleanor Westbrook, will you marry me? Will you be my wife, my Duchess, my partner in whatever comes?" Tears streamed down Eleanor's face. "Yes, yes, I will." He slipped a ring onto her finger, simple gold with a small sapphire, beautiful in its restraint. Edward stood, and they kissed not with passion but with tenderness, with promise, with the full weight of their impossible choice. Vincent began to clap, loudly and deliberately. Lady Ashworth joined him, then Lord Whitmore. Gradually, perhaps a third of the room applauded. Another third stood in shocked silence. The final third turned away or made for the exits. "This is disgraceful." Lord Marlborough's voice boomed across the ballroom. "I will not remain to witness this farce." He left, taking several families with him, but others stayed. "Well," Lady Thornhill murmured to her daughter, "that was unexpected, but rather brave, don't you think?" Young debutantes whispered among themselves, "Can you imagine loving someone that much? My mother would never allow it. But it's rather romantic, isn't it?" Lady Beatrice approached Edward and Eleanor. The room watched with bated breath. She stopped in front of Eleanor, her face still composed. "Miss Westbrook, Your Grace, I want you to understand something. I still believe this is a mistake. I still believe you will both face trials you cannot yet imagine." Eleanor met her eyes steadily. "I know, Your Grace. However," Lady Beatrice paused, "my son has made his choice, and I will not abandon him, even when I disagree." She extended her hand not warmly, but formally. Eleanor took it, curtsying deeply. "Welcome to the Ashford family, Miss Westbrook. God help us all." "Thank you, Your Grace. I will try to be worthy of the trust His Grace has placed in me." Lady Beatrice leaned closer, her voice dropping for Eleanor's ears alone. "See that you do." She turned and walked away, but she had not left, she had stayed. And that meant something. The gala continued, but everything had changed. Some doors had closed, but others unexpectedly had opened. Edward and Eleanor stood at the center of the storm they had created, hands joined, facing the future together. It would not be easy. Society's judgment would not soften overnight. But they had survived the worst of it, the public declaration, the initial shock. And they had done it together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, they had won the only victory that mattered, the freedom to love openly, honestly, and without shame. The Duke of Ravensshade had proposed to a kitchen maid in front of all of London, and London, for better or worse, would have to live with it. Chapter 8. The Morning After. The morning room at Ravensshade Manor had always been Eleanor's favourite space in the house when she'd been permitted to clean it. Now, she sat at the breakfast table as its mistress-to-be, the London newspapers spread before her like evidence at a trial. Edward sat across from her, his coffee growing cold as he read aloud from the headlines. "Duke of Ravensshade shocks society with unprecedented betrothal," he read, his voice dry. "Aristocratic scandal. Peer marries beneath his station. And my personal favourite, love or lunacy. The Ashford engagement." Eleanor tried to smile, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. "At least they're asking the question." Edward moved to the article itself. "One wonders if the Duke has taken leave of his senses. What respectable woman of quality will now associate with a Duchess risen from below stairs?" "They have a point," Eleanor said quietly. "They have nothing of the sort." Edward set down that paper and picked up another. "Here's another. While one admires his graces. Romantic notions. One cannot help but question the wisdom of such an unprecedented match. That's almost kind, relatively speaking. And here," Edward's voice brightened slightly, "Lady Ashworth, the Dowager Countess of Westfield, was observed speaking warmly with Miss Westbrook. Perhaps society's standards are not as immutable as once believed. Eleanor felt genuine warmth at that. Lady Ashworth has been a godsend. The morning post arrived, brought by Thomas the footman, who'd served at Ravensshade for 15 years. He set the silver salver down with his usual formality, but Eleanor caught the flicker of sympathy in his eyes before he withdrew. Edward sorted through the correspondence, his face growing progressively grimmer. He handed several letters to Eleanor without comment. The first was from Lady Marlborough. The Duchess of Marlborough regrets she must withdraw her invitation to the summer house party, as circumstances have changed. The second from Lord Pemberton. Lord Pemberton finds it necessary to dissolve the business partnership with the Ravensshade estate, effective immediately. Eleanor read them with growing dismay. Edward, the financial losses are manageable, he said firmly, but she could see the tension in his jaw. Then Edward handed her 2 other letters, his expression softening. Lord Whitmore's bold handwriting sprawled across expensive stationery. My dear Ashford, pay no attention to the fools. 40 years ago, they said the same about my Sarah. Now she's the most respected hostess in Kent, and half the people who cut us then come begging for invitations. Stand firm. Time will prove you right. Whitmore. Lady Ashworth's note was characteristically direct. Edward, excellent work last night. You have more spine than your grandfather, and he was a formidable man. Miss Westbrook impressed me greatly. Bring her to tea Thursday. We have plans to make. Ashworth. Eleanor felt tears threaten. Not everyone has abandoned us. No, Edward agreed, reaching across the table to take her hand. Not everyone. Later that morning, Eleanor found herself alone in the library, surrounded by books on estate management, household accounts, and aristocratic etiquette. She'd pulled down volume after volume, trying to absorb in hours what other women learned over lifetimes. Mrs. Thornbury found her there, perched on a ladder reaching for yet another tome. You're drowning yourself in books again. Eleanor climbed down, clutching the duties of a country house mistress. I have to learn, Mrs. Thornbury, how to be a duchess, how to manage an estate, how to be something you're not, how to be worthy of what he's given up for me. Mrs. Thornbury took the book gently from Eleanor's hands and set it aside. Child, he didn't give up anything he valued. He traded a false life for a real one. But the costs, the business partnerships, the social connections, the invitations, are his to bear. You cannot protect him from the consequences of his own choices. All you can do is be yourself and build this life together. Eleanor sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. What if I fail? What if I'm not enough? Mrs. Thornbury knelt beside her, taking Eleanor's hands in her own work-worn ones. Then you fail, and you try again. But Eleanor, you've been not enough in their eyes your entire life. Has it stopped you yet? In Edward's study, Mr. Chambers, the solicitor, spread financial documents across the desk with methodical precision. Your Grace, I must inform you of the practical consequences of your engagement. Go on. Edward's voice was steady, but he braced himself. Lord Pemberton has withdrawn from the Northern Mining Consortium. Lord Blackwood has followed suit. That represents approximately 30% of your investment income. Can the estate absorb the loss? Mr. Chambers adjusted his spectacles. Yes, but there will be tightening. Several London properties should be sold. The Scottish hunting lodge can be let, and the household staff will need to be reduced. The door opened. Eleanor entered, still carrying one of her estate management books. Reduced by how many? Mr. Chambers looked startled. Ladies didn't typically attend financial meetings. Miss Westbrook. Perhaps 15 positions. Eleanor's face went pale. 15 people losing their livelihoods because of me. Not because of you, Edward said firmly. Because of others' prejudice. The effect is the same. Mr. Chambers cleared his throat. Actually, Miss Westbrook, if I may, I've reviewed the household accounts. There's significant waste. With proper management, we could reduce costs without losing positions. Eleanor moved closer, suddenly focused. What kind of waste? Duplicate services, inefficient purchasing practices, that sort of thing. Someone with, practical experience might streamline operations considerably. Edward saw the connection immediately. Eleanor has managed household budgets before, on a much smaller scale. Nevertheless, Mr. Chambers said, warming to the idea, if your Grace would permit, Miss Westbrook might review the accounts. Edward looked at Eleanor, seeing the spark of purpose kindle in her eyes. Would you? Yes, I can try. In her private sitting room, Lady Beatrice wrote carefully to her sister Margaret, choosing each word with the precision of someone navigating treacherous waters. Dearest Margaret, yes, the rumors are true. Edward has done exactly what the papers report. I am still processing my feelings on the matter. Miss Westbrook is not what I expected. She's more intelligent than I gave her credit for, more dignified under pressure. She does not presume, nor does she grovel. I find I cannot hate her, though I wish I could. It would be simpler. Edward is happier than I've seen him in years. That should please me. It does, in a way that makes me ache with regret for my own choices. I have decided to support this match publicly, even as I question it privately. He is my son. What else can I do? Your conflicted sister, Beatrice. She sealed the letter and sat for a long moment, staring at nothing. At White's Gentlemen's Club that evening, Lord Vincent Hartley faced down Lord Huntington with the same casual courage he'd shown at the gala. Hartley, you're throwing away your social standing for Ashford's folly. Vincent sipped his brandy calmly. If my social standing depends on abandoning a friend for making an unconventional choice, then it's not worth having. You'll regret this. I doubt it, but I'd certainly regret cowardice. Lord Huntington's face reddened. Several other members watched the exchange with interest. Vincent had drawn his line in the sand, and everyone knew it. Sunday morning brought Eleanor's first public appearance in Ravenshade Village as the Duke's acknowledged fiancé. The church was packed, word had spread, and curiosity drew people who hadn't attended service in months. Eleanor felt every eye on her as she walked down the aisle on Edward's arm. Some faces showed warmth, others careful neutrality, still others open disapproval. The vicar, a thoughtful man who'd known Edward since childhood, had chosen his sermon with deliberate care. "Let us remember the parable of the Good Samaritan," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the stone church. It was not the priest or the Levite men of high station who showed mercy, but the Samaritan, whom society deemed low. God judges the heart, not the pedigree. The message was unmistakable. Eleanor felt Edward's hand find hers in the pew. After the service, the congregation divided itself naturally. Some approached warmly, offering congratulations and support. Others made conspicuous exits, avoiding eye contact entirely. Mrs. Baker, the village baker's wife whose daughter Eleanor had tutored in reading years ago, gripped Eleanor's hands with flour-dusted fingers. "Miss Westbrook, or should I say, Your Grace to be, you've given us all hope. If you can rise, perhaps the rest of us need not know our place so, certainly." Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the words. "I'm still just Eleanor, Mrs. Baker." "No, miss." Mrs. Baker's eyes were bright with emotion. "Your inspiration." That afternoon, Edward and Eleanor sat together in the morning room again, this time planning their wedding. "We could wait," Edward suggested. "Let society adjust. Give people time to—" "Or we could proceed as planned," Eleanor interrupted. "Show them we're not ashamed." Edward studied her face. "You're braver than I am." "No, I'm just too stubborn to back down now." The door opened. Lady Beatrice entered, carrying a leather-bound book Eleanor recognized as the Ashford family wedding registry. "If you're to marry in 6 weeks, we have much to do." Edward looked up in surprise. "Mother, you don't have to." "Of course I do. You're my son. This is a family wedding. It will be done properly, even if—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Even if it's not traditional." "Thank you, Your Grace," Eleanor said quietly. Lady Beatrice met her eyes. "Don't thank me yet. I'm a demanding mother-in-law. You'll earn that title of Duchess. I'll see to it." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "Good. I don't want it given. I want to earn it." Something shifted in Lady Beatrice's expression, the first genuine smile Eleanor had seen directed at her. "We may understand each other yet, Miss Westbrook." Over the following days, subtle signs of change emerged. Letters began arriving for Eleanor, young women writing to ask advice on defying parents' marriage choices, seeking courage from her example. Invitations trickled in, not from the highest tier of society, but from thoughtful, independent-minded families who valued character over convention. A progressive newspaper ran an editorial praising Edward's choice as the future of a more merit-based aristocracy, and in servants' halls throughout London, Eleanor's story spread, whispered, embellished, transformed into legend. The kitchen maid, who became a duchess. 6 weeks until the wedding. 6 weeks to prepare for a life neither of them had imagined. The immediate storm had passed, but the real test lay ahead, not the dramatic moment of proposal, but the quiet, daily work of building a marriage and a life together. Eleanor sat in what would soon be her study, estate accounts spread before her, finding inefficiencies and solutions with the practical eye of someone who understood value. Edward watched from the doorway, his heart full of pride and love. They were learning something society hadn't taught them, that defying convention was the easy part, living with the consequences that required courage of an entirely different kind. But as Eleanor looked up and smiled at him as he crossed the room to kiss her forehead, they both knew they had made the right choice. Not the easy choice, but the true one. And truth, in the end, was worth any price. Chapter 9. 6 weeks later, the wedding and beyond. Dawn broke over Ravensshade Manor on Eleanor's wedding day, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the guest wing, Mrs. Thornbury helped Eleanor into her wedding dress with hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from emotion. The gown was simple but exquisite ivory silk that draped elegantly without pretension. Eleanor had refused an elaborate train. "I'm not pretending to be something I'm not," she told the dressmaker firmly. Lady Ashworth's pearls rested against her throat once more, and her mother's wedding ring hung on a delicate chain around her neck, her only inheritance, her connection to the woman who taught her to value learning and character above all else. Mrs. Thornbury stepped back, tears glistening in her eyes. "Oh, child, you're beautiful." "I'm terrified," Eleanor admitted, her reflection in the mirror showing a woman she still didn't quite recognize. "Of marrying him. Of everything that comes after." Mrs. Thornbury smiled gently. "That's called life, Eleanor. Everyone's terrified of it. You're just honest enough to admit it." Annie burst into the room, flushed and breathless. "Miss Eleanor, I mean. Your Grace." "Eleanor is fine, Annie. Between us, always Eleanor. There's ever so many carriages arriving, more than they expected." Eleanor's heart skipped. "More?" Mrs. Thornbury exchanged a meaningful look with Annie. "Perhaps society is more curious than condemning. Or perhaps your courage has inspired more support than you knew." Ravensshade Manor's private chapel had been transformed. Roses from the garden where Eleanor and Edward had first truly talked filled the space with subtle fragrance. The chapel was small, built to seat perhaps 100, and they'd expected 50 guests at most. 87 people had come. Lady Beatrice sat in the front row, composed and regal in Ashford blue. Beside her sat Edward's uncle and aunt, recently returned from the continent, and surprisingly supportive. Lord Vincent stood at the altar as Edward's best man, his presence a visible declaration of loyalty. Lady Ashworth occupied a prominent seat, making her support unmistakable. Lord and Lady Whitmore sat nearby, their 40-year marriage a testament to the possibility Eleanor and Edward represented. And there, to Eleanor's genuine surprise, sat Lady Caroline Pemberton without her father, a deliberate choice that spoke volumes. Younger aristocratic couples filled several rows, progressive-minded families who valued character over convention. Edward's Cambridge friends clustered together, grinning with the particular delight of seeing a friend defy expectation successfully. But it was the back rows that made Eleanor's throat tighten with emotion. Mrs. Thornbury sat with the other Ravensshade servants, Annie, Thomas, Cook, and 20 more. Local villagers filled the remaining spaces, Mrs. Baker and her family, the schoolteacher, the blacksmith, the vicar's extended relations. The absent families were notable Lord Marlborough's circle, several of the highest houses, traditional aristocratic stalwarts. But there were fewer absences than expected. The vicar, who'd baptized Edward as an infant, began with words chosen deliberately. "We are gathered in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Marriage is not about station or circumstance, but about the union of two souls committed to love and honor each other. Edward stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on the chapel door. When it opened and Eleanor appeared, walking alone down the aisle, his breath caught visibly. She'd insisted on walking unescorted. "I've made my own way this far," she'd told him firmly. "I'll make my own way to you too." The ceremony proceeded with traditional simplicity. "Edward Ashford, Duke of Ravensshade, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Edward's voice was clear, certain, carrying to every corner of the chapel. "With all my heart." "Eleanor Westbrook, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eleanor's voice emerged strong and steady. "I do." The vows they spoke were traditional, but weighted with meaning earned through struggle. "I, Edward, take you, Eleanor, to be my wife." to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. I, Eleanor, take you, Edward, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. When Edward kissed her, tender and genuine, applause broke out from everyone, even some who'd been skeptical. The reality of the moment was undeniable. I present to you, the vicar announced with satisfaction, Edward and Eleanor Ashford, Duke and Duchess of Ravenshade. Eleanor's breath caught at the title. Duchess. It was real now, irrevocable. The wedding breakfast in Ravenshade's great hall proved more joyful than anyone had anticipated. Music filled the space. Class barriers blurred as servants and aristocrats mingled with unprecedented ease. The champagne flowed freely, and laughter echoed off ancient stones. Lady Beatrice rose to give the first toast, her composure perfect but her words surprisingly warm. I will not pretend this marriage is what I envisioned for my son, but Edward has never been one to follow expectations. Even as a child, he chose his own path. Light laughter rippled through the hall. What I have learned these past weeks is that sometimes our children see more clearly than we do. Edward saw in Eleanor qualities that matter more than breeding: integrity, intelligence, courage. Perhaps those are the true marks of nobility. She paused, her eyes finding Eleanor's across the room. Eleanor, you have taken on a difficult role. Society will judge you harshly. Some already have. But you have also shown remarkable strength. I may not have chosen you for my son, but I am beginning to understand why he chose you. Lady Beatrice raised her glass. To Edward and Eleanor, may your courage be rewarded with happiness. Genuine applause filled the hall. Vincent's toast came next, characteristically irreverent. I've known Edward since Cambridge. He was always the responsible one, the dutiful one, while I was out causing trouble. So imagine my surprise when he became the scandal of London. Laughter erupted. But here's what I know. Edward has never been happier. Eleanor has never been anything but genuine. And if society can't accept that, society is the poorer for it. To my best friend and his brilliant wife, may you always choose truth over convention. Lord Whitmore's toast brought tears to several eyes. 40 years ago, I stood where Edward stands. My Sarah was a vicar's daughter. They said I was mad. Perhaps I was. But I've had 40 years of genuine partnership, of love that wasn't arranged by families or solicitors. Edward, Eleanor, the first year will be hard. The 10th will be easier. And the 40th, you'll look back and wonder why anyone thought it was strange at all. When Eleanor rose to speak, her nervousness was obvious. I'm not accustomed to public speaking. You spoke beautifully at the gala. Mrs. Thornbury's voice rang out, prompting laughter and easing Eleanor's tension. Thank you. I just want to say, I know many of you took a risk by coming today. Some of you lost invitations, faced criticism, or risked your own social standing. I cannot repay that kind of loyalty, but I can promise you this. I will work every day to be worthy of Edward's trust and your support. I may not have been born a duchess, but I will earn the title through my actions. Applause welled. And to those who stayed away, I understand. Change is frightening, but perhaps one day you'll see that what Edward and I share is not so different from what you hope for in your own marriages. Love, respect, partnership, truth. Half the room rose in standing ovation. The other half offered polite applause. It was enough. The first dance brought Edward and Eleanor together in the center of the hall. She'd spent 6 weeks learning formal dancing and still felt uncertain, but in Edward's arms, the steps came naturally. You did beautifully, he murmured. The speech, the ceremony, all of it. I nearly fainted 3 times. So did I. Eleanor laughed softly. You're the Duke of Ravenshade. You're not allowed to faint. Even dukes are human, I've learned. You've taught me that. What have I gotten us into? Edward pulled her closer. Everything that matters. Eleanor sat in her study, still a marvel, reviewing estate accounts with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She'd found ways to save 15% without cutting staff, streamlining inefficiencies that had persisted for decades. Edward entered with correspondence. You'll want to see these. The first letter bore Lady Marlborough's seal. Eleanor opened it with trepidation. Dear Duchess, I was wrong to withdraw my invitation. My granddaughter has asked why she cannot marry for love like the Duke did. I had no good answer. Would you and Ravenshade join us for tea next month? Marlborough. The second came from a stranger. Your Grace, you don't know me, but you've given me courage. My father wants me to marry Lord Ashton, a man twice my age whom I don't love. I've told him no. He's furious. But I keep thinking, if a kitchen maid can become a duchess, surely I can choose my own husband. Thank you for showing us it's possible. Miss Catherine Blackwood. The third was from Mrs. Baker. Your Grace, my daughter has been accepted to Teachers' College. She never thought to apply, thought it wasn't for girls like her, but she saw what you did, and she thought, why not try? You've changed more than your own life, Your Grace. You've changed what's possible for all of us. With deepest respect, Mrs. Baker. Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. Edward, you're not just a duchess, Eleanor. You're a symbol of what's possible when courage meets love. I'm just trying to survive each day. That's all any of us do, but you're doing it visibly, and that matters. 6 months later, Eleanor and Edward walked the garden paths at sunset, following routes that had become sacred to them. Eleanor's hand rested on her barely swollen belly, subtle enough that most wouldn't notice, but Edward knew. Do you regret it? Any of it? Eleanor asked. Not for a single moment, do you? Only on Tuesdays. Edward laughed. Tuesdays? That's when Lady Pemberton hosts her insufferably proper tea parties, and we're still not invited. We have our own tea parties, with people we actually like. Eleanor smiled. True, though ours do involve Mrs. Thornbury and Annie drinking directly from the pot when they think I'm not looking. A much more honest approach to tea. They walked in comfortable silence, the evening light gilding everything gold. Your mother spoke to me yesterday, Eleanor said quietly. Oh? She said she was proud of how I'm managing the estate accounts. That's high praise from her. And she said something else. Eleanor's voice softened. She said, I wish I'd had your courage 30 years ago. Edward squeezed her hand. We're not friends, exactly, but we understand each other now. That's more than I hoped for. Edward, there's something I need to tell you. I know. Eleanor stopped walking. How do you... You've been avoiding wine at dinner. You've been tired, and you have a particular glow that... Edward's face broke into wonder. Eleanor, are we? She smiled through sudden tears. Yes, we are. Edward pulled her close, his own eyes wet. A baby. Our child. Eleanor, do you realize that our child will be an Ashford heir born of a kitchen maid? Yes, the irony is not lost on me. That our child will be raised knowing that love matters more than lineage. That character matters more than convention. That's the legacy we're building. Society will say, society will adjust. It always does, eventually. Edward kissed her forehead. We're not the first to challenge it. We won't be the last, but we're doing our part. I love you. I love you. And I would make the same choice again, 1,000 times over. The Duke of Ravenshade's marriage to Eleanor Westbrook remained controversial for years. Some doors never reopened, some relationships never recovered. But slowly, imperceptibly, the world changed. Other aristocrats began to marry for love, citing the Ashford precedent. Women of Eleanor's former station saw new possibilities. The rigid hierarchies of Victorian society began, ever so slightly, to soften. Lady Beatrice eventually reconciled fully with her daughter-in-law, recognizing in Eleanor the daughter she might have been had she possessed courage 30 years earlier. Vincent Hartley married a merchant's daughter 2 years later. If Edward can do it, why not I? And Eleanor herself became one of the most respected philanthropists in England, using her position to advocate for women's education and workers' rights. She never forgot where she came from, and she made sure society never forgot either. Their first child, a daughter, was named Elizabeth Beatrice Ashford. She grew up knowing her mother had been a kitchen maid and her father a duke, and she learned that both histories were equally important. Years later, when Elizabeth asked her mother if it had been worth it, all the scandal, all the pain, all the social cost, Eleanor took her daughter's hand and said simply, I chose love. Everything else we built together. Yes, my darling, it was worth everything. In the garden at Ravenshade Manor, 2 figures walked together in the fading light, a duke and a duchess, a man and a woman, 2 people who had chosen each other despite the world's objections. They had faced society's judgment and survived. They had built a life that was authentically theirs, and in doing so, they had proven something revolutionary. That love, when chosen with courage and defended with integrity, could indeed conquer all, even the rigid barriers of Victorian England. The Duchess had sworn the kitchen maid would never marry her son, but she did, and in the end, it was society that had to change. And so, dear listeners, Eleanor and Edward proved that sometimes the bravest act is not defying society, but living authentically, despite its judgment. Their love didn't change the world overnight, but it changed what was possible, and perhaps that's the greatest legacy any of us can leave. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Lyra's Romance Stories for more tales of courage, passion, and love that defies expectations. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Eleanor and Edward made the right choice? Would you have had the courage to stand against society for love? Share your reflections in the comments below. I read every single one, and your insights always enrich these stories. Until next time, may you always choose truth over convention and love over fear. This is Lyra, reminding you that the most beautiful stories are the ones we have the courage to write for ourselves.